You sat through the leadership offsite, the session on culture, the workshop on resilience, maybe even a few talks on mindset. All of it aimed at helping you handle the pressure better, stay sharper for longer, and lead with a clearer head. But the following day, on an ordinary Tuesday at 3 o'clock, you're making worse calls than you were at 9 o'clock. Your patience is thinner than you know it should be, and somewhere in a meeting earlier, you heard yourself say something that you're probably going to kind of regret. All that investment into becoming a better leader, and none of it holds up after lunch. Nothing about your mindset has changed between 9 and 3. What has changed is your nervous system just simply got fried. I'm Gavin Eivers, a strength and conditioning and rehabilitation coach and cognitive performance specialist. And for over 2 decades, I've been helping people who think for a living perform better at work by training their body. Now, more and more of that work is now with people running businesses and leading teams. And the pattern I see in senior leaders is different from almost anyone else that I coach. It's rarely one big moment that they need to be sharp for. It's decision after decision, conversation after conversation for 10 or 12 hours a day with a room full of people that expect so much from them. So today I want to talk about why the businesses spending the most amount of money on performance are often investing in exactly the wrong level. And what exactly decides whether a leader is still sharp walking out the door at 6 p.m. as they were when they walked in at 8 a.m. A single high-stakes meeting is one demand on your system. A leader's day is full of them, dozens of them, back to back, with almost no recovery built in between them. And that's a completely different job for your brain than most of the performance advice is built for. Now, the first thing to go isn't your intelligence, it isn't your years of experience, it's a specific piece of biology called the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain doing the judgment calls, holding your temper, weighing up the options under pressure. The prefrontal cortex is expensive to run. It's the first thing to start flagging once you've been under strain all day, which is exactly why that kind of 4 o'clock version of you makes worse calls than the 9 o'clock version of you, even though the problem in front of you is the same thing. It didn't get any harder, it's just harder for you to deal with. So what decides how well that holds up across a long day? Well, it's not really about how sharp you can get in one moment. It's about how quickly you can recover between moments. So every time your system reads something as high stakes, it releases cortisol, which is part of what's called the HPA axis, which is your body's slower stress response system. Now, that could be a difficult conversation, a financial issue that's gone wrong, a decision with no good option. All of it lands the same way, physiologically speaking. Now, a bit of that is completely normal. It's actually quite useful. The problem is what happens next. In someone whose system is well conditioned, that cortisol rises and comes back down fairly quickly, ready for the next demand. And in someone whose system isn't, it stays elevated for longer. So the next stressful moment lands on top of the last one that hasn't really cleared yet. Now, that's not a mindset difference. That's a difference in how efficiently your physiology recovers. Researchers who've compared trained and untrained people's response to a stressful task find exactly the same pattern. The fitter group, they show a smaller cortisol spike to begin with, and then it comes back down to baseline much quicker afterwards. So it's the same stressful task, same brain, just a physiologically different recovery curve. There's also a second marker worth knowing about called the vagal tone, and it's a measure of how well the calming branch of your nervous system, which is the parasympathetic branch, can step in once a stressful bit is over and bring things back down to normal. Now, a higher vagal tone means faster recovery between demands, and the single most reliable way we know to raise it is consistent aerobic and resistance training. Not one amazing great workout, it's the accumulated effect of training regularly over months and years. So that's the real reason why some leaders are still sharp at 6 while others have quietly kind of fallen apart at 3. It was never about who's naturally calmer or who's got a better attitude. It's about whose nervous system clears each spike of pressure fast enough to meet the next one with something left in the tank. I've talked before on this channel in previous episodes about how lifting can sharpen your focus and running helps build memory. Both of those still really matter here too, but the leadership specific piece I'm talking about now is the capacity to recover quickly. The ability to take a hit or unwanted news or a difficult conversation, or like when you're in a meeting room and it's gone quiet and everyone's kind of waiting for you to give your answer. Those kind of things, and then deal with that stress, come back down cleanly rather than carrying it into the next one. Now, that's what the training builds, on top of everything else that it's already doing for your brain and body. Now, let me give you a real example. If you watch any of my episodes before, you know I like to give an example. It just helps me explain the principle or concept. Now, I had a client who was the CFO of a really large accountancy firm. He was really sharp with numbers, as you'd expect his whole career, but then he got promoted and the job really changed for him. It was more about board meetings, presenting headlines to a room and leading a team instead of just kind of looking after himself and crunching numbers. Now, by mid-afternoon, he was running on empty and he was getting short with people in a way that wasn't really like him, and he'd quietly decided that he just wasn't cut out for the people side of the job. Now, I didn't buy that for a second. He was a really nice guy and I didn't think that was the reason. And it wasn't why he came to see me in the first place anyway. He was actually referred to me by his knee surgeon. Now, I used to specialize in helping people avoid surgery, and a lot of good surgeons don't want to do surgery. Surgery is the last resort. So he referred him to me, sent him in my direction, and my approach was to train the whole system. So not just the joint, but the system as a whole. So we would look at his sleep, his food, and then his general strength and fitness. Within a few weeks, his energy has shifted and his patience had come back, and his team actually noticed it before he did and made a comment to him. And then back to the knee, he had a reassessment with his surgeon a couple of months later, and the surgery was cancelled. It wasn't needed. And then he actually went on to go skiing about 6 months later, and then started playing golf again every week. Now, the reason I mention that is just emphasizes the kind of power of looking at your nutrition, your exercise and your recovery to make everything better, mentally and physically. Now, I want to be honest about where the evidence is direct and where I'm kind of joining the dots a little bit, because nobody is, as far as I'm aware, nobody has run a trial on leadership decision making across a 12-hour day. But the closest real world evidence isn't in an office at all. It's in elite sport and in the military. It's in the places where recovering between repeated high stakes moments has actually been trained and studied on purpose, deliberately. A tennis player, for example, doesn't get a timeout between points. They get about 15 or 20 seconds, and elite players use every single one of them. Walking back to the baseline, grabbing a towel, having a breath, a reset before the next point starts. And special forces operators are trained in exactly the same skill, but under a very different name. Deliberately slowing their breathing between decisions in a sustained operation to bring their system back down before the next big thing lands. Different world, same physiology, same job. You've got to recover fast, meet the next demand with something left in your tank. Now, I'm obviously not comparing a CEO's job to war or Wimbledon final, but the mechanism underneath is identical, and it's been properly studied in both. Nobody's built that exact study for a chief executive on a Tuesday, but a leader's day is built from the same shape, decision after decision with no timeout built in. And the mechanism doesn't care what your job title is. If people are watching how you handle each one, that's exactly the physiology you're relying on, whether anyone's named it to you or not. And here's where I think a lot of corporate well-being spending goes to the wrong level. Businesses invest in culture and environment, in mindset, in the away day, in the resilience workshops and all that kind of stuff, while the actual hardware, the body and the nervous system doing the deciding, gets nothing at all. You can't think your way to a faster cortisol recovery, and no away day is going to fix a physiologically depleted brain. So here's what I'd actually say to any leader looking at the week ahead and wondering why some days they hold up and other days they just don't. It's not about trying harder or steadying your mindset in the moment. Build the underlying capacity so there's more of it to draw on when you actually need it. Consistent training widens that capacity. Both the resistance work and the aerobic work that I've talked about loads of times on this channel elsewhere, they play their part. Do them regularly, and that fourth horrible conversation of the day starts to feel a little bit easier. The sharpest leaders I know don't train because they've got exceptional discipline. They train because they know their body is the reason the 4 o'clock version of them still shows up like the 9 o'clock version one did. And if you want a clearer picture of where your own capacity stands right now, how you're moving, sleeping and recovering, and how that's likely showing up across a demanding day, I put together a free 3-minute assessment that looks at exactly that. Now, I'll put the link in the description. And if you find this kind of thing useful, the newsletter is where I go deeper into this kind of thing every single week, and you can subscribe below. Have a good day.